You know, I wanted to whip up a storm when I did my book tour, but I didn't really want to have what we have outside. So I'm very grateful to all of you for coming here. I know that I have, how do you say, more than fair weather friends in the city. I'm also delighted to be here. This actually is the first event of what's going to be a 2-week book tour. And I'm glad that it's starting here at the Foreign Policy Association because, as the chairman mentioned, I received this medal last year from FPA. I was very grateful for that. I'm very happy to repay my debt to the association. Let me, maybe I should begin by explaining why I wrote this book, Beyond the Age of Innocence, Rebuilding Trust between America and the World. And the simple answer is that my view, my assessment is that over the course of the past few decades, America as a country, as a society, has built up huge reservoirs of goodwill all over the world. And some of these reservoirs of goodwill, in fact, were built up almost unwittingly. But they are a great resource for America. The danger that we face now is that these reservoirs of goodwill in many parts of the world will be replaced either by reservoirs of ill will or in some cases, as you know, of pure hate. And I fear that we may be reaching what I call a tipping point, which is that up to now, where the reservoirs of goodwill clearly have been much larger than the opposite reservoirs, we may be coming to a point where the opposite reservoirs may be larger than the reservoirs of goodwill. And this is why I think it's time for America to stand up and do an assessment, both of its standing in the world and of its role in the world. And the purpose of my book is to help America make such an assessment. I should, by the way, emphasize also at the very outset that I should declare what my biases are, where I stand on this issue. I think those of you, and many of you here, I think know me well, know that I'm not anti-American. My wife's from Summit, New Jersey. My 3 children, by the way, also, as of now, are dual nationals. They carry both Singaporean and American passports. So when they travel with American passports, I can feel directly how they're regarded or how they're treated. So what I propose to do in my remarks today to get the discussion going is, and I'll speak for another 15 minutes or so, if that's okay, and leave about half an hour for Q&A. I'll first try and explain how and why America built up these huge reservoirs of goodwill, and then in the second part explain why the opposite reservoirs have begun accumulating. On the first part, which of course is the good news part, and in my book, by the way, I try and identify what I think are the critical issues that have led to this build up of goodwill towards America and the world. The first factor is what I call hope. And as you know, on our planet, we have about 1 billion people who live comfortably in one form or another in modern developed societies. And we at least have 2 or 3 billion people living in relatively desperate circumstances. I mean, the figures are what, 3 billion, less than $2 a day, whatever it is. And for many of these people, they're not quite sure whether there will be, frankly, a better tomorrow, whether the lives of their children will be better. But when they try to find hope, they look around and they say, where would I like to be? Or where would I like my children to grow up in? And the answer almost inevitably is America. And the reason why the answer is America is because there is this belief in many parts of the world that if you come to America, even if you come penniless, you can make it in this society. There are no barriers, there are no ceilings. If you are good, this society will recognize you, and this society will propel you upwards. And if you look around the world, by the way, in most societies of the world, you'll find they know of someone either from their country or from their neighborhood who migrated, arrived in the United States with nothing, and then succeeded. I mean, you have the story, I guess you must know, of Vatan Gregorian, how he arrived in this country is described in his autobiography. You have the story of Arnold Schwarzenegger coming from Austria, and he's a hero back in Graz, his hometown. So these are the sort of stories that lead to this, you may call it a myth, but it's a real perception out there that if you want to succeed in any place, go to America. And by serving as a symbol of hope, I think America plays a very useful role in the world. The second way in which America has accumulated, again, a significant amount of goodwill is through the remarkable education it has been providing to elites around the world. And as you know, if you wanted to, for example, understand why Asian societies, as you know, which they have stumbled very badly in the last 2 centuries, and they're finally waking up, finally getting their act right. And this applies, by the way, even to the 2 most populous countries in the world, both China and India. And if you want to understand the reasons why they're succeeding, and what's interesting, by the way, is that China and India are succeeding, as you know, in completely opposite fashions. I mean, China is run still by the Communist Party of China, and India, frankly, is a fully functioning democracy. Both societies are taking off now. But one factor you find in common, if you look at the elites of both these societies, you'll find increasingly that most of them have been trained in North America. You find that China nowadays has some of the youngest mayors in the world, within 35, 45 years old. They've been trained in Harvard or Stanford. And certainly if you go to India and you look at the success of India, you have this strong North American connections among the Indian elite. And here I'm glad that Alan Goodman is here because he can probably give us the statistics. I forget now, last night I was told there are 80,000 Indian students now, I believe, in the United States, and China 60,000, I believe. And just imagine these 80,000, 60,000 serve as the yeast that lift up the sort of great societies of China and India, and the yeast, of course, is provided by American education system. Another way in which America has benefited the world hugely, and this, of course, is a very, what I call a strong, silent contribution that America has made since the end of World War II, and this is through the creation, as you know, of a multilateral order that allowed new nations to rise, grow, and develop. And by doing so, by the way, America changed something. Should I carry on? Okay. I'm not sure what happened. Somebody is taping my talk. So far, I'm only saying good things. It's okay. I think, see, the great thing about the rise of America as a major power is that it changed the grain of human history. Because until then, you know, when the European powers, great European powers emerged and became powerful, their natural impulse, by the way, was to demonstrate their power by going out and colonizing the world. And this happened with each successive European power as it emerged. And frankly, when America reached the height of its power, especially at the end of 1945, when it was so much stronger than any other country in the rest of the world, it could have easily repeated the same pattern of history and said, okay, now I'm the top dog, now it's my turn to go out and colonize the world, and I have my own empire. But as you know, America did the exact opposite. Instead of, in a sense, going out to colonize the world, it actually encouraged the European powers to decolonize the world, and that frankly made a huge difference to the rest of the world. I see this also from personal experience, because as a child, I think from 1948 to 1959, for 11 years, I lived in a British colony. And, you know, British colonial rule, by the way, was the best form of colonial rule you can ever have. If you look at the record of the other European powers, I'm not just saying this because our chairman is of British origin. You look at the record of British colonies, they've done much better than other colonies have. But whatever you may say, in a colonial rule, you still live as a second-class citizen, not as a first-class citizen. And the great thing about America, when it became powerful, is that it encouraged all countries in the world to emerge and rise and succeed. And that's through the creation of this wonderful multilateral order that America created in 1945. And that's why, by the way, we have seen, in a sense, a breaking in the traditional pattern of history, where in the traditional pattern of history, when new powers emerge, in one way or another there will be conflict and tension. So far, between 1945 and the year 2005, 60 years have gone by, new powers have re-emerged, Japan has re-emerged, Germany has re-emerged, and there's been no conflict. That's because the world order now allows new powers and new economies to emerge. The fourth way in which America has benefited the world, and this is something that will be seen as surprising by most people, by the way, is the role of American military power. And as you know, American military power, especially today, is so huge. In fact, American military budget now is more than 50%, I gather, of the global military budget. And it serves many functions, many purposes. But one of the purposes of this great American military power is that it acts, in a sense, as the last pillar of global stability. That if you want to ensure that all the international waterways, for example, are open to international shipping, if you want to ensure that no power decides to say, hang on a second, you shall not cross these international waters, you know that in the final resort, the American Navy will sail through it to demonstrate that these are international waterways and this should be kept free for the global community. This is not a intended service that the American military wanted to do for the rest of the world, but this is what it actually does through its overwhelming strength and presence. And the remarkable thing, as I mentioned earlier, about American military power is that with this huge power, frankly, America could go out and colonize half the world, but it hasn't done so. And in that sense, by and large, it does more good than harm to the world. But I must, of course, quickly add that the reason why perceptions have changed to some extent towards American military power is because of what happened in the Iraq War. And that, I guess, I'll talk about in the second part of my remarks, when I talk about the change in attitudes towards America, and when these reservoirs of goodwill began to be depleted and be replaced, as I say, by reservoirs of ill will. Now, there will be, for a long time, a very strong and lively debate among historians on when exactly attitudes towards America began to change, on when exactly attitudes towards America began to be more negative than positive. And I make a somewhat, I guess, controversial claim in the book that the fundamental change occurred at the end of the Cold War. That when the Cold War ended, and as you know, America won the Cold War, America decided that it no longer needed to worry about the world. It could walk away from the world. And in the process of doing so, by the way, I more often than not unintentionally, occasionally intentionally, stirred up new forces for which we are now seeing either the consequences or the results. And the best way of illustrating this point is, I guess, through a few examples. The first area, by the way, and this is not a great secret, as you know, the first part of the world where indeed attitudes towards America have become significantly negative, as you know, is in the Islamic world, among the 1.2 billion Muslims who live in the world today. And it's not a big secret that attitudes, by and large, are often more negative than positive in this world. But having said that, I want to emphasize in the course of my remarks also, do not underestimate the complexity of the Islamic world. Do not underestimate that the nuances that you find even in the Islamic world is not a simple black and white picture. Putting that aside, you find that clearly that's the part of the world where America's standing has fallen considerably, and the question is why. And of course, most Americans assume that this happened despite the good deeds, the good works of America. But if you did, for example, a very objective analysis of how, for example, Osama bin Laden emerged, how Al-Qaeda emerged, and this I think is a matter of historical fact, that he emerged first in the Cold War as an instrument to be used against the Soviet Union. And indeed, at that point in time, there was even a sense of celebration in Washington, D.C., that we have stood up these Islamic jihadist forces to go against the evil Soviet communists. And these Islamic jihadist forces are great because they will fight to the end and they will not walk away from any struggle. And indeed, the Islamic jihadist forces, as you know, converged in Afghanistan during the Cold War, and by and large did a very good job of draining and weakening the Soviet army. Now when the Cold War ended, the logical thing to have done would have been to say, okay, we have now woken up these forces, how do we bury them now? How do we ensure they don't run loose in the world? But instead of that happening, and this is all, I guess, again a matter of history, America walked away from Afghanistan, and incidentally also walked away from Pakistan, and left behind in Afghanistan the seeds for what you saw happening in 9/11 over here. So the forces that had been generated were allowed to continue to grow, and taking advantage of various issues, portrayed themselves as the defenders of the Islamic world, and frankly also as a result accumulated a lot of sympathy for their cause. One of the most controversial points I say in the book, and I must say that I felt uncomfortable writing it, but in the sense I wanted to put it down because it was what I had experienced. I asked my friends, I said, what have you heard about the reactions? Where were you when 9/11 happened? And what were the reactions when 9/11 happened? One thing that surprised me is that I came across several people who gave me first-hand, not second-hand, not third-hand, first-hand stories of what they saw when 9/11 happened. And as you know, Tom Friedman described in one of his columns how American-trained Saudi doctors and nurses cheered when 9/11 happened. I've heard similar stories in different parts of the world. And the fact that this happened, the fact that people actually cheered when the towers came down, was an indication that there are reservoirs of anger out there towards America, and they revealed themselves when 9/11 happened. But the Islamic world clearly is an area that requires enormous amount of attention on the part of America. And I can tell you, by the way, that when I wrote the chapter on America and Islam, it was by far the most difficult chapter to write, to try and create the right balance between explaining on the one hand what America had done, trying to explain also why, in very careful terms, why the Islamic world had turned in some ways against the United States. The other part of the world that I speak about in the book, by the way, what I say, by the way, is that if America has been unwise in allowing this anger to accumulate among the 1.2 billion Muslims in the world, it has also been imprudent in the way that it has handled China. Now, that may come as a surprise to you because on the surface, as you know, especially in the last 4 to 5 years, frankly, US-China relations have been quite stable. And because they've been stable, you assume that there is nothing fundamentally wrong in the US-China relationship. But I think those who analyze the relationship also know that there's a great deal of fragility to it. That indeed, while on the surface things seem to be functioning reasonably well, underneath the surface, especially, I would say, I think to be fair, both in Washington and Beijing, there's a lot of suspicion about the long-term futures of both countries. And I've increasingly found that when I speak to Chinese, including young Chinese intellectuals, they are now almost convinced that because China is succeeding, America at some point in time would trip China up and try to prevent China from emerging. And the question is, where does this suspicion come from? What has America done to generate this suspicion? And what I found in trying to understand the US-Chinese relationship is that you could have both sides looking at the same event in exactly opposite ways. And the best example I use is something that happened just barely 5.5 years ago. I think you're all aware of this famous US bombing of the American embassy in Belgrade. I think it was May 1999. And Chinese embassy in Belgrade. And every American that I've spoken to, and many of the policymakers are friends of mine, by the way, Stroop Talbot, Tom Pickering, Stan Roth, these were all the key policymakers on Asia at that time. And they said to me, of course, Kishore, it's a mistake. Why would the United States want to bomb the Chinese embassy in Belgrade? It was an errant missile, or it was intended for someone else, or why would America want to bomb the Chinese embassy? But every Chinese I've spoken to, no matter what level, by the way, it can be the most senior, frankly, to the most junior, and without fail. And this is, by the way, the score in the survey is not 99%. The score is 100%. Every Chinese I've spoken to has said to me, we know it was deliberate. This was a signal to China. Watch out. This is what American power is. So if you can take one incident like that, and you can see this huge gulf of perceptions, you begin to understand that there is a divide out there, and there is a problem emerging, in that sense, in the US-China relationship. And even when America thinks it is trying to be helpful to China, and this is a classic example, of course, is the United States saying it'd be great if China becomes democratic. And I happen to know that the Americans who say that mean well for China. They want China to grow and succeed and become modern by becoming democratic. But the Chinese policymakers, when they see American efforts to promote democracy, they don't see the Americans as meaning well for China. They see America as trying to destabilize China, and what they will say is they would like us to collapse like the Soviet Union collapsed. They would like us to have a Gorbachev that led to the implosion. What you saw in the implosion of the Soviet Union is what America wants to do to China also. So you have, again, the same things being looked at in completely opposite ways. So if you have this gap in the Islamic world, you have this gap with the Chinese, you have similar gaps, by the way, in other parts of the world. I obviously can't touch on all parts of the world, but just a few stories. You take, for example, what happened in 1997 in the great Asian financial crisis, as you know, that happened. And I know, for example, take a country that has been probably among the most pro-American countries in Southeast Asia. This was Thailand, and Thailand, as you know, is technically an ally of the United States through an agreement. When the Asian financial crisis began in Bangkok, many Thais assumed that because Thailand had been a strong ally, a steadfast ally of the United States all through the Cold War, all through the difficult times, that in the final resort, when Thailand got into trouble, the United States would, in one way or another, help Thailand through the crisis. And I know from speaking to my Thai friends that it came as a big psychological shock to them when America decided that Thailand was not important and therefore Thailand had to solve its financial problems on its own. Unlike, as you know, and I quote this in the book, in the case of Mexico with a financial crisis, because Mexico was at America's borders, you had a huge effort to try and stabilize Mexico. But in the case of Thailand, when Thailand went through a similar financial crisis, no effort really was made to rescue Thailand. And this came as a shock, as you know, to the Thais. And till today, you'll find, for example, in Southeast Asia, memories of America walking away at the time of need. And just give you another story. Recently, the new president of Indonesia, Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, wanted to appoint a very bright young technocrat minister, Sri Mulyadi, I think is her name, to the post of finance minister. When the Indonesian parliament found out about it and found out that she had been director in the IMF, they said, sorry, if she's with the IMF, she's too close to the Americans, we don't want her. This happened a few months ago. This is an indication of how attitudes towards America are. So, I mean, I can give some of the stories, but I think I'm going to stop around now. But the final point I want to make to you, this is probably the most important point I need to put across here and in the book also, is that all is not lost. That there is still time for America to rectify the situation, to regain, to rebuild the reservoirs of goodwill that have existed out there for so many decades. But for this to happen, there has to be clearly some change of course on the part of America. And there's some things that the United States will have to do to regain the goodwill it has lost. And I give a few examples in my final chapter. The first, of course, is in a sense to decide that a world order in which other countries are growing, thriving, succeeding is also in America's interest. That America will welcome the emergence of new powers and not feel threatened with the new powers emerging. And this basically is a signal that says a country like China is looking for from the United States. Is looking for some kind of clear signals. The second thing, and again, I apologize for this, in trying to rush through my remarks, I may be simplifying things, but I hope maybe I can elaborate them a bit more. But the second thing that America can do, by the way, is to go back and see what it did right in 1945 with the multilateral order. Because with that multilateral order, America created a universe which allowed most countries in the world to feel that there was a level playing field, that they could also grow and thrive in that kind of level playing field. Increasingly, there is a perception, unfortunately, that too many of the major multilateral institutions, whether it's the UN Security Council, whether it's the IMF, whether it's the World Bank, they're seen often, more often than not, as instruments of American power rather than instruments being used to create a global order for the benefit of all. Now this, again, as I emphasize, is a very crude summary, but that I'm trying to capture very quickly is a perception that exists out there. The third thing that I say, by the way, that can be done is to apply something which I call the law of intended consequences. One point that I did not touch on today is the impact of American power on the rest of the world. And one reason why American power sits more heavily on the world today, incidentally, is a result of two forces. The world, on the one hand, is shrinking. It's getting smaller and smaller. American power is not shrinking. Indeed, in some ways, it's getting bigger. So if you can imagine American power remaining as strong as ever and the world shrinking, it means that American power impinges on the lives of more people around the planet. And the simplest example that I can give, by the way, to illustrate this point, is, for example, when the United States decides to give cotton subsidies to 25,000 cotton farmers in some of the southern states, 10 million farmers in West Africa are impoverished. There's a direct correlation between these two actions. Now, when America gives subsidies to its cotton farmers, it's not intending to harm anybody else, but the effect, frankly, is to hurt other people, and America's got to be aware when and how it hurts other people. Final point, I'm going to sit down now, is that I think, and I do want to emphasize this point because this is the point I emphasized at the very beginning, that the reason why there's so much goodwill towards America in the world is because America is still perceived to be the one society in the world where you can succeed, whether you're rich or poor, or no matter where you came from. And if you continue to serve well, in a sense, as a beacon to the rest of the world, especially in allowing immigrants to come in, succeed, grow, do well, and to go back to their countries, that process of churning immigrants, developing them, sending them back to their societies, will create, I tell you, huge reservoirs of goodwill towards America. Thank you very much.